It's now my pleasure and honor to welcome back to the truth John Eastman. He may be the nation's foremost constitutional lawyer. He taught law in California. Worse, though, he tried to bring truth and light to the 2020 election. And now he's had to pay a price. John Eastman, welcome to the truth.
John, thanks for having me back on. I always enjoy doing your program.
Well, you're so kind, and we enjoy having you on too. So after 2020, you went to Georgia, and I believe you testified before the Senate committee on the 2020, looking at the 2020 election. Um, Similarly, in Arizona, what was your alleged misconduct there?
Well, in Arizona, I don't quite know why I'm on the indictment list there because I didn't have anything to do with any of the election challenges. I didn't have anything to do with any discussions with the electors. At the request of one of the state legislators, I took a call with the speaker of the assembly and told them that if there was illegality in the election, their rules weren't followed. They had authority to look at that. And that was it. But that was apparently enough to add me to the indictment list in Arizona.
So you basically testified before the Georgia State Senate Committee, the Judiciary Committee, headed by uh, William
Ligon.
Ligon. Thank you. Actually, a friend of mine from Brunswick, Georgia, who looked at the 2020 election, and you and Rudy Giuliani and others were there. You had a lesser role in Arizona, and what happened as a consequence of those interactions?
Well, I'm on indicted in both. Co-conspirator number two in or number three in Georgia. Trump is one, Rudy's number two, and I'm number three. And then indicted co-conspirator alleged in Arizona, number 13. That's because they put all the electors first, and then Rudy, and then me. And I was unindicted co-conspirator number two in the Jack Smith case against President Trump in D.C. Again, all for raising questions about illegality that occurred in the 2020 election and trying to
As a
develop
lawyer,
constitution. Yeah, as a lawyer,
as a
recommending
lawyer.
strategies to try and get the election illegalities addressed by the courts.
So, as you know, you and I first became acquainted with one another because I worked on the case of Jefferson Satira versus the Fulton Board of Elections with Bob Shealy, who is also one of the defendants, one of your co-defendants in the Fonnie Willis 19 fiasco. And I've seen the evidence. I've played devil's advocate with the forensic accountants, and I've watched the videos from the State Farm Arena. How is this even possible, John? It is mind-boggling to me. You see people working the tabulating machines taking the same stack of roughly 100 ballots and feeding them through the tabulators multiple times. In one case, 32 times. Yet they get a verdict against Rudy Giuliani for defamation to the tune of $148 million and basically ruin his life. New York took his bar license. They tried to get his property. I just read today that he entered a settlement agreement with them yesterday. I don't know whether you have any insight into that or not, but I want to talk about all that. But first of all, just how does this happen in America today? I mean, it's just scandalous to me that this could even happen.
Well, one of the problems, and I think the defamation case was brought in the District of Columbia.
Yeah.
One of the problems is you don't get a fair jury pool in a jurisdiction that is so hyper partisan, unbalanced one direction rather than the other. I think 95% of the people in the District of Columbia are not just Democrats, but violently anti-Trump Democrats. And so you're not going to get a fair trial. And, so I think that's one of the problems. The other problem is facts seem not to matter. Look, the illegality that was clear cut in the Fulton County arena, I mean, the State Farm Arena in Fulton County, was that they sent people home. And then they continued to process the ballots after people had been sent home.
A violation of
Now,
state law.
You can process ballots if people aren't there to observe, as long as you've given them notice of when you're going to be processing the ballots and sending them home, telling them that we're going to reconvene at 8:30 the next morning. And the governor and the Secretary of State's claims that they weren't sent home, that they just left because other people were leaving is false. We've got sworn affidavits that said they were told that counting was stopping for the night to go home and they would reconvene at 8:30 the next morning. Sworn affidavits. And you can see it happening on the video. When they continued to process after the observers had been sent home, that was a violation of state law. Whether those ballots were fraudulent that were pulled from under the table in a ballot bin on wheels, some state officials even call those suitcases. So whether it's a suitcase or a ballot bin, it's immaterial. And whether the ballots in those bins were valid ballots or fraudulent ballots, well, we'll never know because the observers weren't there. The whole point of having observers there is to make sure nothing untoward goes on. And then you've got, you're absolutely right, the multiple scannings. And of course, their claim is that, well, that was because of a jam. Now, we've not been able to connect the dots on that, but Garland Favorito's litigation, which is still pending, and they were given a forensic audit access to one of the machines, and they have proved that in fact ballots in batches of 100 were counted multiple times. And how do we know that? Because in Fulton County, all of the precincts were counted in that one facility. And when you put randomly those 490 precincts in a batch of 100, the odds that that batch are identically replicated in that exact precinct order in any two batches is like, one in a trillion. I mean, it's 100 to the 490th power. Impossible. And they found in 1 week of a forensic audit on one machine, 5,000 ballots that had been scanned and counted multiple times. Now, whether that was the video that we see the multiple scannings going on at State Farm Arena, we don't know because they didn't get the timestamps on when that occurred. But the fact that ballots were scanned multiple times or replicated inside the software multiple times and counted was proven in that case. And yet, if you raise that question, you're going to be targeted for challenging the government's narrative.
That was just the tip of the iceberg. You've got four pretty credible witnesses: Susie Voiles, Scott Hall, Bridget Thorne, Robin Satir, who each independently testified that they saw a pallet full of pristine ballots that appeared to be untouched by the human hand, that all were scored identically. And of course, for Joe Biden, and a pallet full, estimated, maybe call it 20,000 ballots. What about that little factoid? And then the fact that there were people registered at UPS addresses, homeless shelters, vacant apartment buildings. I mean, Joe Rossi and David Cross, two numbers guys, not working together, both concluded that there were 40,000 illegal votes in Fulton County, 400,000 illegal votes in Georgia combined. Now, I know there's no reason to litigate 2020. Nothing is going to change by that, but there are two salient points. One, we don't ever want it to happen again. It is what makes our country a republic. It is sacred to our democracy. Two, they're still persecuting you.
Yep.
Donald Trump won. They haven't gotten the memo. Tell us what's going on.
Well, and we take this issue up in the documentary that Madison Media Fund just produced, and we premiered at Mar-a-Lago on January 4th, and President Trump and Italian Prime Minister Gloria Meloni came along with Senator Marco Rubio to watch it with us. It was great fun. But this is the thing, even if we were wrong about the fact claims and the law claims, the notion that shining a light on illegality in the conduct of an election is somehow a part of a criminal racketeering enterprise conspiracy, which is what the Fulton County indictment against all of us says. It's just utter nonsense. It's a weaponization of our criminal justice system, weaponization on steroids, lawfare on steroids, if you will. And the fact that there is all of this still lingering evidence confirming that we were right to at least raise questions about what went on uh, should mean that these criminal cases should never have been brought and that they ought to be dismissed. And quite frankly, the people that were responsible for bringing them ought to be charged with malicious prosecution. Uh,
I think that if there's a conspiracy, it's among them. The people that are claiming foul are the ones that are doing foul. And Judge Brian Amero in that case, and Favorito and the case I referenced are actually one and the same, but the parties have different lawyers. But Judge Brian Amero ruled that the petitioners had demonstrated a prima facie case. Now, why is that not significant? Why does that not completely absolve you and the other 18 defendants? Number two, he ordered the absentee ballots be unsealed and provided for the petitioners to be able to examine them. We think that's where the smoking gun really lies. But of course, they've never been allowed to look at the absentee ballots. And I suspect that those ballots no longer exist. I would think that that would likewise be exculpatory for each of the defendants, or at least render the cases moot if evidence has been destroyed. So, how do they get away with this? And who was the puppet master? That's what I want to know. Who was pulling the strings?
well, there's a lot of money rolling in. We just learned last month, for example, in the Arizona criminal litigation, that the Attorney General of Arizona, a rabid Democrat advocate, she campaigned on saying, "I'm going to get these people for raising questions about election integrity because it's undermining our democracy." That was her campaign. She may well have stolen the election. There were certainly allegations to that effect. But she hired a violently anti-Trump nonpartisan NGO, non-governmental organization called States United Democracy Center to prepare the prosecution strategy for her. It just boggles the mind. That's like hiring a fox to develop your safety manual for your chicken coop. I mean, it's utter nonsense. And yet, and they're well funded. One suspects from many of the George Soros funding front organizations or what have you, they're well funded. Their mission is to bring these bar complaints against people all over the country. Their sister organization called the 65 Project actually said our goal is not just to get all the attorneys disbarred, but to make them so toxic in their firms and their communities that lawyers won't ever want to take on these kind of cases again. In other words, they want to destroy the adversarial system of justice by scaring lawyers from taking on clients or causes that the deep state, the entrenched bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, doesn't want to have. And by the way, this played out in this week's confirmation hearings as well. One of the questions from, I think it was Dick Durbin of Pam Bondi, designated for become the next Attorney General, was, do you defend Trump's claim on the call with Brad Raffensperger that, go find me 11,780 votes so I win this election? They continue to do this false narrative. Of course, Trump said that, but it was only after this first sentence where he said, we've identified about 150,000 ballots. All you have to do is find 11,780 of them, and I win this election. And so, the Washington Post had to do a retraction on its false story initially, and yet the Democrats continue with this false narrative, this propaganda to try and it's the big lie. If they repeat it often enough, then they think a lot of people will then start to think it's true. And it is blatantly false. And yet those that point out the falsity, that raise question, it's Orwellian. If you don't repeat the lie that 2 + 2 is 5, and then come to believe the lie that 2 + 2 is 5, we're going to utterly destroy you. And that's what's going on here. It is an authoritarian, tyrannical type of government move that one should never have expected to see in the United States of America. And that's one of the reasons why I'm standing up and fighting so hard against this stuff, because the consequences of losing this battle are far beyond whether I keep my bar license or even whether I stay out of prison in Georgia or Arizona or not. The very ability to be free people in this country is at stake if we don't put an end to this lawfare and this propaganda machine coming out of our way too big central government in Washington, D.C.
I watched the confirmation hearing with Pam Bondi, earlier this week as well. And I guess that's the same hearing that you were talking about with Dick Durbin. And Adam Schiff said, "Are you prepared to say that 2020 was that Joe Biden won that election free and fairly?" And Pam Bondi said that she was not going to engage in a conversation that was laden with gotcha questions. Now, can you please help me understand why pushing back against Adam Schiff when he said that is a gotcha question? I mean, let's suppose that she had said, "Oh, no, I don't believe 2020 was a free and fair election at all." Where is the gotcha in that? Are they going to use that as a means to disqualify her for attorney general? And on what grounds? I can't
Well,
imagine anybody
yeah,
but the Democrats that would oppose her if she had said that.
well, but you got to understand, the Democrats, they would oppose her. They would give them the reason to oppose her, and it would be a great appeal to their base for more fundraising. That where Trump is elected or nominated an election denier for attorney general, and so therefore we can expect to see the abuse of the Department of Justice to go after people that were simply certifying valid and free and fair elections. This is the narrative. Right. This is the narrative. It's the most extraordinary example of psychiatric transference or projection that we've probably ever seen in history. The claims that it's Trump that is going to weaponize the Department of Justice, when Trump himself and people like me and Rudy have been on the receiving end of the most egregious weaponization of our Department of Justice for the last 4 years.
Well, I have been a student of the Kennedy assassination for 65 years. As bad as the assassination was, the cover-up that ensued afterwards was equally bad because, obviously the assassination cost our president his life, but the cover-up cost 60 people their lives, like Dorothy Kilgallen, who went and interviewed Jack Ruby in prison and came back and called her friend Mary Smith and said, "Read the paper this week. I'm going to blow the lid off the Kennedy assassination." And she woke up dead the next morning. And it goes on and on and on. I won't get bogged down on it, but my point is very simply that I called 2020 uh, JFK 2.0 because I think the deep state killed Kennedy, Allen Dulles, Johnson, Hoover, the deep state of the time. I think the deep state politically attempted to assassinate Trump in the 2020 election, and they did prevent him from taking a second term then. But what they did subsequently, everything they did backfired. They are so incompetent and so stupid that they have lack the capacity to see that the things that they do actually result in the opposite consequence that they had hoped for. And the mystifying thing is they keep doing it. Like, "Oh, well, I
Right.
didn't perfect it the first three times, so I'm going to try it again." And
Well,
they keep getting the similar result.
their view is that they didn't put enough effort into it. So if they only put more effort into it next time, it'll succeed. By the way, a little story. I haven't followed the Kennedy assassination stuff other than kind of on the periphery. But I was a college student working at summer at the Eastman Kodak Film Lab in Dallas. Went to college at the University of Dallas, and my dad had worked for Eastman Kodak his whole life, and so one of their employee benefits is summer jobs for the employees' kids. And so I was working in the film lab in the late 1970s when I was in college, and a lot of the people that were in the lab, the older folks, had been there in 1963, and they told me stories about the processing of the Zapruder film, and that it was crystal clear when it came off the processing line, and they don't understand what happened to it, that it's so fuzzy and what have you since. So maybe just another little piece in the puzzle of the conspiracy, if there was one.
Well,
I also
there's
saw a recent
if
account that one of the reasons they wanted to shut down they came up with the magic bullet theory is because there may have been a friendly fire problem with a young and overly nervous Secret Service agent in the front seat that accidentally
right.
shot it.
I,
And that
I've
information came out in the 1970s, but
I've
we
read
didn't
that
really hear much about it.
I've read that extensively. I happen to discount that particular iteration, but the fact of the matter is that I mean, we could spend the rest of the day talking about the Kennedy assassination. My listeners are sick of hearing about it because I've been talking about it for 3 years. But the reason that I continue to talk about it is because I feel that it is emblematic of just how bad the deep state is in this country. And that's something that's just right in your face. What are they doing that we don't know about? And I've called for a cleansing in America. I think all the secrets have to come out. The Kennedy assassination, the Epstein files, the J6 files, the 2020 election files. I think we need to get it all out there, and that we have, if we're ever going to have the moral authority to lead the world, we cannot be bad actors. And I fear that many, many people in our federal government are just absolutely rotten to the core. In fact, I have had a very prominent longtime Washington journalist tell me that you can count on both hands the number of congressmen and senators that are either not corrupt or compromised. And I very much have this perception, the suspicion that that is true, and that that explains why we continue to pass continuing resolutions and we can't get budget reform, and that when we send billions upon billions of dollars to the Ukraine, which very few people in America support, that it's somebody else that's calling the shots and not our elected representatives. And so I'm concerned about it. I know that sounds very conspiratorialist from a lot of people, but I've watched this stuff, I study it, and I watch people and their behavior and the events that follow. And we were having a conversation earlier today with a guest, and we talked about the rhetoric that comes out of Senate and congressional hearings. And it's very invigorating when they get up there and they nail a witness and they put them under pressure, like Christopher Wray, when the congressman from Texas said how many confidential human sources were there in the Capitol on January the 6th. And he said none. And then the Michael Horowitz report comes out, the inspector general's, that reports that there were as many as 26. So we know that Christopher Wray lied. Now that makes me very suspicious when the head of the FBI perjures himself before Congress with no consequence. And
Without
so,
any accountability or consequence.
none.
Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro went to prison for refusing to comply with a congressional subpoena because they were going to violate executive privilege. And yet people that blatantly lie, and you go back to Eric Holder, that blatantly lie, he lied about, as far as I can tell, about the what was the guns to drug dealers scandal. Lied about that, and no consequence. So if you're on the side of the entrenched bureaucracy or deep state, they'll cover for you. If you dare to raise questions about it or challenge it, you're going to get destroyed. This is intolerable, and I think one of the reasons why they're pulling all the stops out to stop Trump, to stop his nominees right now, because Trump learned in the first administration how deep this problem really is. These guys have been there so long, they think that the president works for them rather than the other way around. There was a
Mhm.
wonderful, interesting story in the New York Times back in December of 2020, after Bill Barr had stepped down as Attorney General, and Trump was looking at naming Jeff Clark as acting Attorney General. And the New York Times had this story about how scandalous that was, that Trump would pick who he wanted to be Attorney General. Or there was another story about that Trump wanted to do things that was contrary to the opinions of the intelligence community. It's like, well, excuse me, the intelligence community works for him. He's the guy we elected, not these unelected bureaucrats, unnamed, unelected, anonymous bureaucrats. But they actually think that the president is there to do their bidding rather than them there to follow the agenda and the orders of the president. I
Well,
was
who
on the
can
phone
blame them for
call.
thinking that way? Because they've had Joe Biden for 4 years, and I think that's exactly the model that they've followed, and probably not terribly unlike uh, George W. Bush, who was told that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that led to a 12-year war. And you talk about the guns for money to fund covert activities. So, I mean, there's a long precedent for that. But before we move on, just the sheer hypocrisy of sending Bannon and Navarro to prison for refusing a what really was an illegitimate subpoena issued by Congress because the committee was not constituted legitimately. So I would
Right.
argue that they couldn't issue a subpoena if the committee was illegitimate to begin with. But Merrick Garland was guilty of the same thing that he prosecuted Navarro and Bannon for.
Yep. I
How
know. I
duplicitous
know.
can one person be?
Well, and look, I mean, for the first time in the history of the Congress, that committee took the position that if you asserted a privilege, they would not go to court to file a motion to compel your testimony and then have a neutral court address the privilege claim. They would decide the validity of the privilege claim themselves. They'd meet for 5 minutes, they'd vote unanimously to reject your privilege claim and then come back. And then if you didn't answer, you're in criminal contempt of Congress. They tried to do the same thing with me, not just on my attorney-client privilege claims, and they were going to decide those claims on their own. And then I would be left in the position if they say, well, we reject your attorney-client privilege claim. If I answer the questions then in breach of my obligation to my clients in violation of attorney-client privilege, I get disbarred. If I don't answer the question, I get criminal contempt of Congress. I mean, this is the nonsensical game they played with this. I agree with you, illegitimate committee. It was not constituted according to the rules of the House. There was no minority ranking member because Liz Cheney was appointed as the vice chair, not by the Republican caucus. And the rules of the House require that before you issue subpoenas, both the majority and the minority ranking member had to sign off on it. There was no such person. So, and beyond that, it was clearly not a legislative function committee. Their whole goal, and they told us this over and over again, was to develop a criminal case against President Trump. That's an illegitimate role for Congress. It violates separation of powers. It violates due process and the Fourth Amendment because they were issuing subpoenas not based on probable cause, not with a warrant signed by a neutral judge. They were just issuing themselves. And they were general warrants. Give us everything you've got in your emails and your phone communications, and we'll look through them to see if we can find something that we can distort to use against you. This is the very reason we have a Fourth Amendment. It's one of the reasons why we fought a Revolutionary War, is to prevent that kind of behavior. And yet this committee did it from the legislative halls, not even from an executive branch law enforcement agency. So, I mean, the abuses of our constitutional system were just rampant.
Well, it is dire, and I've got 3 minutes and three questions I want to touch on real quick, kind of in follow up to what you were just saying. But Trump is going to be inaugurated just 2 days from when this broadcast airs. Do you feel that he is going to be able to get to Washington safely and be inaugurated without any further attempts on his life? I'll just tell you, I'm concerned, and I'm concerned because they have tried everything. There have been two assassination attempts. Newsmax just ran a story yesterday that said that Trump was not out of the woods and they were concerned that he was in danger. I fear for his safety because I think the deep state, if he gets to be president on Monday, has got a lot of atoning to do. What do you think, John?
Well, I share your concerns. My own experience with the rank and file members of the Secret Service at Mar-a-Lago when we did our premiere there is that they are doing a good job protecting his home in Mar-a-Lago. They've got from Mar-a-Lago north all blocked off on Ocean Drive. They've got very serious security to get into the place. So that I'm encouraged by that. But there were also some unbelievable failures, and they're so unbelievable that one wonders whether in fact it was part of a deliberate effort. The,
Absolutely. And I live right across from Mar-a-Lago. I know every time Trump leaves and goes because I see the commotion that it stirs. And proximate to when Ralph tried to assassinate Trump at his golf course, I had watched the motorcade go by. There were no less than 50 motorcycle policemen in the motorcade from Palm Beach County, from the sheriff's office, from Broward County, from the state patrol. It was a spectacle, and it's to me, it said, look at the lengths that we're going to protect Donald Trump. Meanwhile, my producer sitting right over here, he and I were doing a show on that Sunday. I think it was August the 14th or thereabouts. It was a month and a day after Butler. And the went out that there had been a second attempt. We jumped in the car and went out there. And I spent 3 hours walking around the Trump golf course and the perimeter, and we attended the press conference with the sheriff and the FBI and the Secret Service. The thing that stuck out to me was I've never been trained. I have no experience in protection of a high value asset, but it was so obvious to me that you could have protected that entire perimeter by putting a cop on the corner of Summit and Congress, one at the north corner and one at the west corner. You would have had the entire exposed part of the golf course covered. The rest of the golf course, the sheriff office and the jail is on the northern part, and the western part is surrounded by a swamp and woods. It would be virtually impenetrable, and the golf course didn't go up to the fence line there. But where the president was exposed, you could have put three people there with radios and binoculars. No one would have been able to have gotten through that perimeter. Now, why do they have 50 motorcycle cops who provide very little value other than show, but deprive the president the protection of the perimeter, which I think is asset protection 101?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you and several others with actual Secret Service experience have been raising similar questions. So,
Now,
yes, I
I will
fear and
say
I
this.
keep the
No, I don't mean to. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to add that, like yourself, I've spent a lot of time at Mar-a-Lago. I know many of the Secret Service people in his detail, and I am telling you that they are fine, devoted, dedicated people. They're not the issue. It's the
yeah,
people up there in Washington in the ivory tower that are designing the perimeters and calling the shots. That's where the problem is. And I've been like yourself. I haven't practiced as much law as you have, but I have been a member of the bar since 1979. I did work for the DA at the beginning of my career, and I know when a witness is trying to dodge a question. And you watch Ronald Rutrow in that just embarrassing performance before the United States Congress when he got into a shouting match with a duly elected member of Congress and started talking about his experience defending the country in 9/11. What's that got to do with Butler, Pennsylvania, sir? I'm sorry. You're pivoting. You're throwing up a smokescreen. Answer the damn question. And so that all just fuels my suspicion. I'm sorry.
well, and I will say this, millions and millions of Americans that share concerns about what the deep state wants to do to prevent Trump from taking office are millions of prayers are are coming in, and I think the avoidance of an assassination at Butler was miraculous.
Divine
And the other
intervention.
piece I'll point out is I believe even if they were to accomplish such a mission, which I hope never occurs, um, JD Vance seems equally committed to shining a light on what's going on in the deep state, and they wouldn't buy much at all.
And I think
And
he's
the
every bit
people that
as
will be coming in to take charge and to shine this light on the rats and the bugs. And now, the other thing that's going on in these final days of the Biden administration, they're converting political appointees to careers positions. That's not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to be able to embed your politicos in to deprive the incoming administration of their own politicos. But I saw just a couple days ago over at Department of Labor, they took a civil service position that's for a full term, I mean, a permanent position, and they altered it to a 3-year term so that they claim it avoids the anti-embedding law because it wasn't a permanent. We didn't put in somebody permanent. I think Trump needs to reverse in day one a lot of these recent egregious attempts to embed a deep state that's hostile to the administration that's coming in, and therefore hostile to the American people who elected Trump to take certain actions and pursue a certain agenda. I mean, this is, they keep saying, Trump was anti-democratic because he challenged the results of the election. This is a thumb in the nose, stick in the eye, whatever you want to call it, to the American people who'd had enough about lawfare, who had enough about what our government has been doing without our consent, and elected somebody based on a platform of doing something about it. And they're trying to obstruct the agenda that we, the American people, we the people, the first three words of the Constitution, overwhelmingly voted for. And I hope the incoming FBI director and the incoming attorney general and the incoming head of criminal division and the incoming head of the civil rights division and others understand that this is unconstitutional and illegal behavior. It's federal felonies, in my view, that they fully investigate it, and where warranted, they bring criminal charges against the people that are engaging in this assault on our Constitution.
So Donald Trump won by 77 million votes, or with 77 million votes, I should say. And Fonnie Willis has been determined by the Supreme Court of Georgia to be disqualified from, the Court of Appeals of Georgia, disqualified from being able to continue as the prosecutor in the case against you and the 18 others. So your legal problems are over. You're home
Yeah.
free, right?
I certainly am looking forward to a future unburdened by what has been in the recent past. But no, Fannie Willis was disqualified by the Court of Appeals. She immediately appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court. But even if the Georgia Supreme Court upholds her disqualification, the matter goes before the prosecuting attorney's council, and they will appoint another prosecutor. And the DeKalb County DA has already volunteered to take it over. She's chomping at the bit to get that case and try and make her career on the Democrat side of the aisle by pursuing this case. And they can't go against Trump now. That would violate supremacy clause while he's in office. So I think they'll go after the others, and me included, as a way to say, well, we got their scalps, and that just proves we could have gotten Trump's scalp if the American people hadn't been so foolish as to reelect him. I think that will
So
be their strategy and their narrative going
So
forward.
let me ask you this: if with the disqualification of Fonnie Willis, can't you make a uh, very good legal argument that the indictment has to be thrown out too? I mean, if she was uh, had a conflict of interest while she was prosecuting the case, doesn't it logically follow that she had a conflict of interest when she was bringing the indictment, and that should be tossed, and they'd have to start all over from scratch?
When she was presenting it to the grand jury, I think it's a very good argument. And one suspects that that might be part of the legal strategy going forward by either me or my co-defendants. But I don't want to get in too much of the strategy there. But I agree
I
with you.
understand.
Look, if she's got a conflict of interest, then that ought to infect the presentation to the grand jury, because we all know grand juries are heavily influenced by the way the case is presented to them by the district attorney, or in Arizona by the attorney general.
So, the amazing thing to me is that it doesn't sound like these people have gotten the memo yet. I mean, Trump won in a landslide, and largely because of the mistreatment that he received through the administration of lawfare against him. And now it sounds like they're continuing to double down on the very things that caused them to lose the election. So, I guess we should be glad that they're incompetent, but I'm sorry for you that you're having to go through the process of defending yourself and hiring lawyers. It's got to be an awfully difficult burden to maintain, particularly when you know and I know that what you were doing was being truthful, honest, and an advocate, and actually a very fine, patriotic American. That should be
Well, thank you.
celebrated,
People need
not
to watch this.
prosecuted.
People need to watch this movie. It's called The Eastman Dilemma: Lawfare or Justice, and it's available for free streaming temporarily until it goes up on one of the paid platforms at madisonmediafund.org. And if they want to keep up with the kind of things that we're dealing with, they can visit givesendgo.com/Eastman. We use that as a blog to let people know what's going on. If they are so inclined and want to help with the legal fees, it's a legal defense fund donation site. They can also send prayers which are heartwarming. My wife and I read them. And so givesendgo.com/Eastman. But watch the movie at madisonmediafund.org.
I will.
And I think you'll come away quite impressed with what we're dealing with and angry about it. And will join us in trying to do something about it.
Well, I will look forward to watching that movie personally this weekend. And full disclosure, I have donated to your legal defense fund. I am squarely in your corner. I wish I had more capacity and a bigger megaphone to help, but we all just do what we can. And so I encourage our listeners, if you believe, as I do, that John Eastman's gotten a raw deal, just like Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro and a host of others, like Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, we all have to push back. We have to stand up. We have to do what we can to help these warriors. Send them a buck. Won't hurt. But it'll do an awful lot of good if enough of you do it. So I will certainly do what little more I can do. And thank you, John Eastman, for the sacrifices you've made for our country.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for your support and your very kind words. I appreciate it.
All right, very good. Thank
All
you.
right.
All right, let me know if there's anything I can do, and anytime you want to
Well,
come
we're
on,
gonna
if
we're
you.
gonna do another showing down there with the 47 Club
Oh, good.
at some point, and so I will make sure that we let you know about it.